A mountain man found an Amish girl with no hair, no name, and no shoes, lying half dead on his cabin porch in the middle of a storm. She remembers nothing except prayers whispered in an old tongue. He takes her in, thinking it's just an act of mercy. But soon the church whispers, "She's cursed." And railroad men come thundering, waving papers that say she belongs to them. Why did she escape barefoot through the mountains? What secret is hidden in her past that men would kill to keep buried? In a land where law bends to money, one broken soldier must decide, protect the girl at all costs, or lose her forever to the darkness that hunts her. Will this nameless Amish girl find her place in the world, or vanish again, barefoot in the dust? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the mountain pines like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters of Abel Rowan's cabin. Inside, the mountain man's weathered hands worked methodically, stirring a pot of rabbit broth hanging over the crackling hearth. His eyes kept drifting to the unconscious figure wrapped in his prized buffalo robe near the fire. The young woman's face was pale as winter moonlight, her scalped head bearing testament to some terrible ordeal. Abel's jaw tightened as he considered what brutality had brought her to his doorstep. He'd seen enough violence in the war to last several lifetimes, yet the sight of her injuries stirred something fierce in his chest, a protective instinct he thought he'd buried long ago. "Here now," he murmured, kneeling beside her with a tin cup of broth. Her eyelids fluttered at his voice, revealing eyes the color of summer cornflowers. "Try to drink some, miss. You need strength." She attempted to raise her head, but weakness made her tremble. Without hesitation, Abel slipped one calloused hand beneath her neck, supporting her as he brought the cup to her cracked lips. The familiar scripture verses she'd whispered in German still echoed in his mind, reminding him of his own mother reading from their family Bible on quiet evenings long ago. "Danke," she whispered after several careful sips, the German word for thanks barely audible above the storm's fury. Her eyes closed again, exhaustion claiming her. Abel settled back on his heels, studying her face. She couldn't be more than 20 summers old, he reckoned. Her plain dress, though torn and mud-stained, spoke of Amish ways. But the nearest Amish settlement he knew of was hundreds of miles east. How had she come to be here, alone in the Colorado Highlands? The mystery of her presence gnawed at him as he moved about the cabin, gathering extra blankets and stoking the fire higher against the winter chill. His single room suddenly felt smaller, more confined, with another soul sharing the space. For years, he'd welcomed that solitude, letting it shield him from memories of battles he'd rather forget. Now, watching the steady rise and fall of the young woman's chest, he felt the walls of his carefully constructed isolation beginning to crack. "Lord above," he muttered, running a hand through his graying beard. "What am I supposed to do with this?" The storm offered no answer, only driving snow against the window panes. Abel checked his supply of firewood, knowing he'd need to keep the cabin warm through the night. His own bedroll could wait. The girl needed the buffalo robe more than he did. As evening deepened into night, Abel settled into his wooden chair, rifle across his knees. Old habits died hard, and something about the girl's condition set his soldier's instincts on edge. Whatever, or whoever had hurt her might still be out there in the darkness. His eyes grew heavy, but he fought sleep, watching over his unexpected guest as the fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls. The girl stirred fitfully in her sleep, mumbling prayers in German. Abel caught fragments he recognized from his childhood, pleas for mercy, for protection. His mother had taught him those same prayers, though he hadn't uttered them since the war. Hearing them now in this strange circumstance made his chest ache with long-buried emotions. "Vater unser," she whispered, the Lord's Prayer falling from her lips like autumn leaves. Abel found himself mouthing the words along with her, muscle memory from simpler days taking over. A particularly fierce gust rattled the cabin, making the girl flinch in her sleep. Without thinking, Abel reached for his mother's Bible, tucked away in his trunk these many years. The leather was smooth with age, the pages yellowed, but still holding the comfort of familiar verses. He opened it carefully, letting the firelight illuminate the well-worn text. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, he read softly, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. The words hung in the air like smoke, challenging the barriers he'd built around his heart. Abel closed the Bible, but kept it in his lap, one hand resting on its cover, as if seeking guidance through touch alone. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual settling of the storm outside. The girl slept more peacefully now, her breathing steady and strong. Abel found himself studying the gentle curve of her face, trying to imagine the story written in its lines. Who was she? What family might be searching for her? The questions tumbled through his mind like leaves in a mountain stream. Near midnight she stirred again, this time more purposefully. Her eyes opened clearer than before and fixed on Abel's face. "Wubenik," she asked softly, "where am I?" "You're safe," Abel replied, keeping his voice gentle. "In my cabin in the Colorado Highlands. Found you at my door during the storm." Understanding flickered across her features, followed by confusion. I cannot remember," she said, her English careful but clear. "My name, my family." Tears welled in her eyes. "Easy now," Abel soothed, moving closer to adjust the buffalo robe around her shoulders. "You're hurt and weak. Memory might come back with rest and food." She nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. Her hand drifted to her scalped head, fingers trembling as they encountered the raw skin. "Don't touch," Abel advised. "It needs time to heal. I've seen such wounds before, in the war. You'll mend." "You were a soldier?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Abel nodded, surprised by how easily the admission came. He rarely spoke of those days. "Long time ago. Now I'm just a mountain man who tends his traps and keeps to himself." He paused, studying her face. "Though I reckon the Lord had other plans tonight." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He works in mysterious ways," she murmured, quoting scripture once more. "That he does," Abel agreed, surprising himself again. How long had it been since he'd acknowledged God's hand in anything? "Think you could manage some more broth?" She nodded, and he helped her sit up slightly, supporting her as she sipped from the cup. Her hands shook less this time, strength slowly returning to her limbs. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, "for taking in a stranger." Abel set the cup aside, troubled by the gratitude in her voice. What kind of world was it where simple human decency warranted such thanks? "Any God-fearing person would have done the same," he said gruffly. "No," she replied, her blue eyes suddenly intense. "Many would not. I remember that much." The implication in her words made Abel's hand tighten on his rifle, but he kept his voice steady. "Well, you're safe now. Come spring, we'll find your people. The Amish tend to help their own." She frowned slightly. "Amish, yes, I think, but it's also unclear, like trying to see through river ice." "Don't force it," Abel advised. "Rest is what you need most now. Memory has its own time." She settled back into the blankets, her eyes growing heavy again. Will you read from the Bible?" she asked hesitantly. "It helps me feel less lost." Abel looked down at the book in his lap, then back at her hopeful face. Something shifted in his chest, like spring ice breaking up after a long winter. "I reckon I can do that," he said softly, opening to a familiar psalm. As he read by firelight, his voice growing stronger with each verse, Abel felt the years of solitude beginning to thaw. The girl's breathing deepened into sleep, but he continued reading, as much for himself as for her. Outside, the storm gradually spent its fury, leaving behind a hushed world of new fallen snow. Abel closed the Bible and added another log to the fire. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he had a purpose again, protecting this wounded stranger until she could find her way home. It wasn't the life he'd planned for himself in these mountains, but perhaps it was the one he needed. Dawn crept over the Colorado Highlands, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside Abel's cabin, the first rays of sunlight filtered through frost-rimmed windows, finding the girl stirring on her makeshift bed near the dying embers of the fire. Abel had dozed fitfully in his chair, rifle still across his knees. At her movement, he blinked away exhaustion, watching as she carefully pushed herself to sit up. The buffalo robe slipped from her shoulders, revealing the plain dress that marked her Amish heritage. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "How are you feeling?" She turned toward his voice, her eyes clearer than the night before. "Better, I think," she replied, her voice scratchy from sleep. "Though everything still feels distant." Abel nodded, rising to stoke the fire and set the coffee pot on its hook. "Might take time for your memories to sort themselves out. No need to rush it." He moved with deliberate slowness, aware that his size and gruff appearance might frighten her in the light of day. The familiar aroma of coffee soon filled the cabin. Abel poured a cup, adding a splash of precious milk he kept in his cold storage. "Here," he offered. "This might help chase away the morning chill." She accepted the cup with both hands, but they trembled so badly that coffee threatened to slosh over the rim. Without comment, Abel steadied the cup, helping her take that first sip. "Danke," she murmured, then caught herself. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Abel busied himself preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses. "Before we eat, would you like to say grace?" Her face brightened at this, and she nodded. Folding her hands, she began to pray in German, the words flowing naturally despite her lost memories. Abel recognized the cadence of traditional Amish prayers, confirming his suspicions about her background. After the prayer, they ate in companionable silence. Abel noticed how she took small, careful bites, chewing each one thoroughly, the manners of someone raised in a proper home. It made the mystery of her condition all the more troubling. "Miss," he said finally, "I need to tend to your feet. They're in a bad way from whatever journey brought you here." She glanced down at her feet, wrapped in strips torn from Abel's spare shirt. Dark stains showed through the makeshift bandages. I don't remember walking," she said softly, "but it must have been far." "Reckoned so." Abel set about heating water in his largest pot. While it boiled, he gathered clean rags and a jar of pine tar salve he'd made himself. "This might hurt some, but it needs doing." He helped her move to his wooden chair, then knelt before her with a basin of warm water. Carefully, he unwrapped the bandages, revealing feet cut and bruised from days of barefoot walking. His heart clenched at the sight, wondering what circumstances had driven her to such desperate flight. Despite his calloused hands, Abel worked with gentle precision, washing away dried blood and dirt. The girl sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, accepting his care with dignified grace. When he applied the salve and wrapped her feet in fresh bandages, she whispered another thank you, her eyes downcast in proper Amish modesty. "While you heal up," Abel said, rising to empty the basin, "you're welcome to stay here. Cabin's not much, but it's warm and dry." "You're very kind," she replied, then noticed a torn sleeve on his shirt hanging near the fire. Perhaps I might make myself useful. I could mend that for you." Abel glanced at the shirt, then back at her. "You know how to sew?" "Yes," she said, then frowned slightly. "At least my hands remember, even if my mind does not." Abel fetched his sewing kit, a luxury from his army days that had proved invaluable in mountain life. The girl sorted through the needles and thread with practiced ease, selecting what she needed without hesitation. Her stitches, when she began, were tiny and even, speaking of years of training. "You do fine work," Abel observed, watching her repair the torn sleeve. "Your family must have taught you well." A shadow crossed her face. "Family," she repeated softly. "I hear voices sometimes, in my dreams. Speaking German, singing hymns. But when I try to see their faces..." She shook her head, frustrated. "Don't force it," Abel advised again. "Memory's like a wild creature. Chase it too hard, and it runs further away." She nodded, returning to her sewing. As she worked, she began to hum softly, a hymn that Abel recognized from his own childhood in church. Her clear voice filled the cabin, making the rough-hewn walls seem less lonely somehow. The day passed quietly. Abel tended to necessary chores, keeping an eye on his guest while trying not to hover. She finished mending his shirt and asked for more work, clearly uncomfortable with idleness. He found her a pile of socks that needed darning, and she set to work with obvious relief at having a purpose. As evening approached, Abel prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. The girl insisted on helping, though she had to hold onto the table to stay upright. Her humming continued. Different hymns now, their ancient melodies bringing an unexpected peace to the cabin. Over supper, Abel wrestled with a thought that had been growing all day. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss, we need something to call you, at least until your memory returns." She looked up from her plate, waiting. "Been thinking," he continued carefully, "about a name from Scripture. Miriam, sister of Moses. She led the women in songs of praise after crossing the Red Sea. Seems fitting. What with your gift for hymns?" The girl considered this, rolling the name silently on her tongue. "Miriam," she said finally. "Yes, I like that. It feels right, somehow." "Miriam it is then," Abel said, surprised by the warm feeling that spread through his chest at her acceptance of the name. "At least until we find your true one." "Thank you," she said softly, then added, "Not just for the name, but for everything. For taking in a stranger, for showing such kindness." "No need for thanks," Abel interrupted gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same." Miriam shook her head slightly. "No," she said, with that same certainty she'd shown the night before. "Not everyone would have helped. I remember being afraid. Running. People turning away." Abel's hand tightened on his spoon, anger rising at the thought of others refusing aid to this gentle soul. But he kept his voice steady. "Well, you're safe now. We'll get you healed up, then figure out how to find your people." Miriam nodded, but her eyes grew distant. "My people," she echoed. "They feel so far away, like looking through deep water." But the prayers remained clear, and the hymns. As if to demonstrate, she began to sing properly now, not just humming. The German words of "Gott ist die Liebe" filled the cabin, her voice pure and strong despite her weakness. Abel found himself transported back to childhood, sitting beside his mother in church hearing these same harmonies. When the song ended, the silence felt different, warmer somehow, as if the music had changed the very air of the cabin. Abel realized he'd been holding his breath and released it slowly. "That was right, pretty," he said simply. Miriam blushed at the praise, lowering her eyes in that modest way that spoke of her upbringing. But Abel had seen something in her face while she sang, a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship had stripped away. Whatever had happened to bring her to his door barefoot and scalped had not broken her spirit. As he cleared away their supper dishes, Abel found himself wondering at the strange turns life could take. A week ago, he'd been content in his solitude, wanting nothing more than peace and quiet in his mountain home. Now, watching Miriam return to her mending by firelight, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought long dead, a desire to protect, to help, to be part of something larger than himself. The evening deepened into night, and Miriam's fingers finally stilled on her work as exhaustion overtook her. Abel helped her back to her bed by the fire, making sure she was warm under the buffalo robe. "Rest easy," he said, settling back into his chair with his rifle. "You're safe here." "I know," she murmured, already half asleep. "God led me to your door, Herr Rowan. Of that, I am certain." Abel watched as she drifted off, her breathing becoming deep and regular. The name she'd given him, Herr Rowan, spoke of her Amish upbringing, that formal way of addressing others. It felt right somehow, as did the name he'd given her. Miriam, sister of Moses, who had helped lead her people through the wilderness. Abel didn't know what wilderness this girl was fleeing, but he meant to see her safely through it. It was a purpose he hadn't sought, but one he found himself embracing with each passing hour. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady in the mountain night. Abel added another log to the fire and settled in for his watch, the quiet sound of Miriam's breathing mixing with the crackle of flames. Something was changing in his carefully ordered world, something as gentle yet insistent as the snow blanketing his mountain. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to find out. Morning light streamed through the cabin's small window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Abel stirred the fire and added fresh kindling, glancing over at Miriam, who was already awake, folding her borrowed blanket with careful precision. "Thought you might like to see around the place," Abel said, pulling on his worn leather coat. "If you're feeling strong enough to walk a bit." Miriam nodded eagerly. "Yes, please, I would like that very much." She wrapped herself in the shawl Abel had found for her, moving slowly but with determination. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Abel steadied Miriam with a careful hand as they stepped onto the porch. She blinked in the bright sunlight, taking in the view of the surrounding mountains with wonder. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her face tilted up to the sky, like being closer to heaven. Abel led her carefully down the 3 wooden steps, watching to make sure her bandaged feet weren't paining her too much. "First stop's the barn," he said, guiding her toward the sturdy log structure. "Got to introduce you to old Jack." Inside the barn, a large brown mule lifted his head from his hay, ears pricking forward with interest at the visitors. Miriam's face lit up at the sight of him. "Oh, what a fine creature," she said, reaching out slowly to let the mule sniff her hand. Old Jack stretched his neck forward, whiskers twitching as he investigated this new person. After a moment's consideration, he dropped his head and allowed Miriam to scratch behind his ears. "Well now," Abel said, surprised. "Old Jack usually takes his time warming up to folks. You must have a way with animals." "Perhaps I did, before," Miriam said softly, her smile fading slightly. But she continued petting the mule, who had pressed his head firmly against her palm, clearly enjoying the attention. They moved on to the chicken coop, where a handful of speckled hens pecked and scratched in their yard. Miriam's eyes brightened again at the sight of them. Without prompting, she gathered her skirts and carefully entered the coop, speaking softly to the birds as she collected eggs from the nesting boxes. "You've done this before," Abel observed, watching her sure movements. "Yes," Miriam agreed, then frowned slightly. "At least my hands remember, even if my mind does not." She emerged with 6 eggs cradled carefully in her apron. "Where shall I put these?" Abel showed her to the storage shed where he kept his provisions. While there, he pointed out the stacked firewood along the wall. "Try to keep enough split for a month ahead," he explained. "Winters up here can be fierce." Miriam ran her hand along the neat stack of split logs. "You are well prepared," she said approvingly. "A wise steward of what God has provided." Back in the cabin, Miriam insisted on helping with the morning's tasks despite her weakness. When Abel brought in flour and other supplies for breakfast, her eyes lit up at the sight of the flour sack. Might I make bread?" she asked hesitantly. "I think I know how." Abel nodded, curious to see if this was another skill her hands remembered. Sure enough, Miriam measured ingredients with confidence, mixing and kneading the dough with practiced movements. Her fingers worked the dough with smooth, efficient strokes that spoke of years of experience. Definitely Amish training, Abel thought to himself, watching her work. Everything about her movements, the careful economy, the quiet competence, the way she murmured prayers as she worked, spoke of that upbringing. The morning passed peacefully, the cabin filling with the homey smell of baking bread. But that peace was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Abel moved instinctively to his rifle, but relaxed slightly when he recognized the rider through the window. "It's Doc Miller," he told Miriam, who had frozen at her work. "Circuit doctor. Rides through every few months. No need to fear." Dr. Miller was a gruff man in his 60s, weathered by years of traveling between isolated homesteads and ranches. He tied his horse to the porch rail and stomped his boots before entering. "Rowan," he nodded to Abel, then stopped short at the sight of Miriam. "Well now, what's this?" Abel explained briefly how he'd found Miriam at his door. The doctor's bushy eyebrows drew together as he listened, his eyes fixed on Miriam's scarred scalp. "Mind if I take a look, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. Miriam nodded, though Abel saw her hands trembling slightly as she sat down. The doctor examined her scalp carefully, asking questions about pain and sensitivity. Finally, he stepped back, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Seen something similar before," he said slowly. "Could be fire damage or might be aftermath of a bad fever. Sometimes a high fever can cause hair loss, even memory loss in severe cases." He paused, glancing at Abel. "Course, there's those who'd say different. Some folks get mighty superstitious about such things." "What do you mean?" Abel asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew. Some might call her cursed, the doctor said bluntly. Others might wonder if she's running from something, or someone. People can be quick to judge what they don't understand. He turned back to Miriam, his voice softening again. Not saying that's right or fair, mind you. Just warning you what you might face. Miriam's eyes had filled with tears during his words. Now they spilled over, running down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around herself. "Where can I go?" she whispered. "If people think such things of me, if I have no people, no memory, where is my place?" Abel moved to stand beside her chair, his presence solid and reassuring. "Your place is here," he said firmly, "under my roof until we find your kin or your memory returns. Anyone who has something to say about it can say it to me." The doctor nodded approvingly. "You're a good man, Rowan. I'll keep my ears open as I make my rounds, see if anyone's heard of a missing Amish girl." He packed up his bag and headed for the door, then paused. "I'm heading to the Morrison Ranch now. They've got a boy with fever, but I'll stop back in a few days to check on those scalp wounds." After the doctor left, Miriam remained quiet through the afternoon, though she continued helping with small tasks. Abel could see her wrestling with the doctor's words, with the weight of being a stranger with no past in a land where strangers were often viewed with suspicion. That evening, after a supper of fresh bread and beans, Abel took his rifle and walked the perimeter of his property. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, but he barely noticed the beauty. His mind was on Miriam, on the doctor's warnings, on the fact that he had somehow become protector to this gentle soul who had literally fallen at his door. He checked his usual security measures, the stable door, the storage shed locks, the sight lines from the cabin windows. Years of living alone in the mountains had taught him to be cautious. But now, that caution had a new purpose. It wasn't just his own safety he was responsible for anymore. The evening stars were just beginning to appear as he completed his circuit, rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. Through the cabin window, he could see Miriam setting out cups for evening tea, her movements precise and graceful despite her ordeal. The sight stirred something in his chest, a fierce protectiveness, a resolve that surprised him with its strength. Let them come, he thought, let them bring their suspicions and superstitions. They would find that Abel Rowan's word, once given, was as solid as the mountains themselves. He had promised Miriam safety under his roof, and he meant to keep that promise, whatever might come. 2 days passed in quiet rhythm at Abel's mountain cabin. The morning sun found Miriam growing stronger, her steps more certain as she moved about the cabin and yard. Her eyes had regained their brightness, though she still tired easily. Abel watched her progress with quiet satisfaction, noting how naturally she took to frontier life despite her memory loss. On this particular morning, the air held the crisp bite of early autumn. Dew sparkled on the grass as Abel led Miriam toward the edge of the clearing where the forest began. He carried several lengths of wire and some wooden stakes, while Miriam followed attentively, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Rabbit snares," Abel explained, kneeling to demonstrate. "Set them right and they'll keep meat on the table through winter." His rough hands moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped the wire. "See here? Loop needs to be just so, hanging at rabbit height." Miriam knelt beside him in the damp grass, watching intently. "Like this?" she asked, taking a length of wire and copying his movements. Her fingers proved as deft with wire as they were with needle and thread. "That's right," Abel nodded approvingly. "You've got a natural touch for it." A smile touched Miriam's lips at the praise, but before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridge above the cabin. Abel's head snapped up, his body tensing like a deer catching wind of wolves. "Inside," he said quietly but firmly. "Quick now." Miriam didn't question, rising swiftly and hurrying toward the cabin. Abel gathered the snare materials and followed, his eyes fixed on the ridge where 5 riders had appeared. They were making their way down the slope at a purposeful pace, dust rising behind their horses' hooves. Abel reached the cabin just after Miriam, ushering her inside. "Stay away from the windows," he murmured, taking his rifle from its pegs above the door. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied his racing heart as he stepped back onto the porch. The riders reached level ground, spreading out slightly as they approached. Abel's experienced eye noted their quality horses and well-maintained gear. Not common outlaws then. The man in front wore a railroad company badge on his vest. "Morning," the leader called out, reining his horse to a stop a respectful distance from the cabin. "Name's Marshall, Western Pacific Railroad Company." He touched the brim of his hat. "We're searching for someone, wondering if you might have seen her pass through." Abel's face remained impassive. Not much passes through here except winter storms and spring runoff. Marshall nodded as if expecting this response. "Woman we're looking for would be hard to miss. No hair to speak of. Bald as a winter branch. Escaped from our work camp 2 weeks back, stealing company property in the process." Abel's throat tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Haven't seen any such woman." "That so?" Marshall's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "Description matches pretty close. Young woman, German-speaking by accounts, head scarred up something fierce. Ring any bells?" "Like I said," Abel repeated firmly, "haven't seen her." The railroad man studied Abel's face for a long moment, then gestured to his companions. They began to spread out, riding slowly around the cabin's perimeter. Abel's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. One of the men pointed to the chimney. "Smoke's awful fresh for mid-morning," he called out. "Someone's been tending that fire recent." "I live here," Abel said flatly. "Fire needs tending." Marshall's horse shifted beneath him, sensing its rider's tension. "Listen here, friend. That woman's railroad property, signed contract and everything. She owes work time, and we mean to collect. Anyone found harboring her." He let the threat hang unfinished in the mountain air. Abel took one step forward, his voice low but carrying clearly. "This is my land, bought and paid for. Unless you've got papers saying different, I reckon we're done here." The riders exchanged glances, measuring Abel's stance, the rifle in his hands, the set of his jaw. Marshall's mouth tightened, but he finally nodded. "We'll be riding through these parts regular," he said. "If you happen to spot our runaway, there's reward money for information." He gathered his reins. "Course, there's trouble for those who help her hide, too. Worth keeping in mind." Abel said nothing, standing motionless as the riders turned their horses and headed back up the slope. Only when they had disappeared over the ridge did he lower his rifle and step back inside the cabin. Miriam stood in the center of the room, her face pale but composed. "They were looking for me," she whispered. "So they say." Abel set his rifle down and moved to check the fire, adding a small log. "Don't make their words truth." "But what if," Miriam's hands twisted in her apron, "what if I did sign some contract, if I cannot remember?" Abel straightened, turning to face her. "Listen close now. I've seen railroad work camps. They're no place for any woman, let alone one raised Amish. Whatever story they're telling, I don't believe you signed yourself to that kind of life." Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. "You could have turned me over. Saved yourself trouble." "No," Abel said simply, "I couldn't have." "They will return," she said softly. "You heard their threats? Let them." Abel's voice was quiet but iron hard. "You're under my protection now. That means something up here in the mountains." Miriam looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. "God surely guided my steps to your door." Abel didn't respond to that, but something in his chest tightened at her words. He busied himself checking the cabin's windows and door, making sure all was secure. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning dew and warming the air. That evening, after their simple supper, Abel sat in the doorway of his cabin. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, while inside, Miriam hummed quietly as she mended a shirt. The peaceful scene was at odds with the tension Abel felt in his shoulders. Taking out his whetstone, he began methodically sharpening his axe. The steady scraping sound filled the growing dusk. Each stroke was purposeful, preparing the tool's edge for whatever might come. He had sworn to protect Miriam, and Abel Rowan's word once given was as unchanging as the mountains themselves. Behind him, Miriam's quiet humming blended with the whisper of wind in the pines and the rhythmic sound of the whetstone. Abel worked until his axe edge gleamed like silver in the fading light, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning dawned crisp and clear with sunlight spilling over the mountain peaks like honey. Abel stood in the cabin doorway, watching Miriam make her way carefully to the rabbit snares they'd set the day before. Her steps were steadier now, though still cautious on the uneven ground. "Take your time," he called softly. "Ground still damp from yesterday's rain." Miriam nodded, her shawl pulled tight against the mountain chill. She reached the first snare and knelt beside it, just as Abel had shown her. Her movements were precise as she checked the wire loop, exactly as he demonstrated. "Empty," she reported, looking back at him. "That's all right," Abel said, joining her. "Nature provides in her own time. Let's check the others. Then I'll show you about fetching water." They moved through the morning mist together, checking each snare. At the fourth one, Miriam gave a small gasp of surprise. A plump rabbit lay still in the wire. "God provides," she whispered, then looked uncertainly at Abel. "What should I do?" Abel knelt beside her, his movements deliberate. "Watch close now. You'll need to know this." His weathered hands moved surely, showing her how to reset the snare and handle their catch. Miriam paid careful attention, her face serious with the concentration. "Tomorrow you try," he said, standing and offering her a hand up. "For now, let's see to the water." Abel led her to where 2 wooden buckets sat beside the cabin. He lifted them, handed one to Miriam. "Stream's not far, but the path needs careful feet. Stay close." They made their way down a narrow trail that wound between pine trees and granite outcroppings. Abel watched Miriam's steps, noting how she was growing stronger each day. The sound of running water grew louder as they descended. When they reached the stream, Miriam stopped short, her eyes wide with wonder. The water tumbled over rocks worn smooth by time, catching morning light in its spray. Behind it rose the mountains, their peaks still touched with last winter's snow despite the warming days. "It's beautiful," she breathed, setting her bucket down carefully. "Like God's own cathedral." Abel felt something stir in his chest at her words. He hadn't thought of mountains that way in a long time, though once. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on the task at hand. "Here's where the water runs clearest," he said, showing her the best spot to fill the buckets. "Mind the current. It's stronger than it looks." Miriam nodded, copying his movements as they dipped their buckets. The water was ice cold, fresh from the snowmelt above. When they straightened, Miriam didn't move toward the trail. Instead, she stood still, her face lifted to the peaks. "May we pray?" she asked softly. "I feel him so near here." Abel shifted uncomfortably but found himself nodding. How long had it been since he'd prayed? Since before the war, surely. Since before the blood and smoke had stolen his faith along with so much else. Miriam's voice was clear in the morning air as she began to pray, speaking both in English and her German tongue. Abel stood awkwardly at first, then slowly bowed his head. The words came back to him, rusty, but remembered like an old tune half forgotten. "Our Father," he whispered, surprising himself, "who art in heaven." Miriam's prayer flowed on, thanking God for safety, for shelter, for Abel's protection. His own words came haltingly, but they came. The mountain stream provided accompaniment, its steady rush a reminder of constant in an uncertain world. When they finished, Miriam's face was peaceful. Abel felt different too, not completely changed, but as if something long frozen had begun to thaw ever so slightly. The moment was broken by a low rumble of thunder. They both looked up to see dark clouds building over the western peaks. "Storm's coming," Abel said, lifting his bucket. "We'd best hurry back." They started up the trail, moving as quickly as they safely could with their full buckets. The wind picked up, whispering through the pines and bringing the scent of rain. Another rumble of thunder, closer now. The first heavy drops began to fall just as they caught sight of the cabin. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened up completely. They hurried inside, both soaked despite their speed. Miriam's shawl was dripping and her face was flushed from their quick climb. She looked at Abel, who knew he must appear equally waterlogged, and suddenly she began to laugh. The sound was like music in the cabin, clear, joyful, and completely unexpected. Abel found himself chuckling too, first softly, then with growing strength. When was the last time he had laughed like this? He couldn't remember. The war had stolen laughter along with so much else. But here it was again, brought back by this strange girl who had appeared at his door. "We look like drowned rats," Miriam said, still giggling as she wrung out her shawl. "That we do," Abel agreed, shaking his head like a wet dog. "Better get that fire built up before the chill sets in." They worked together, Abel showing Miriam how to split kindling with careful strokes. Her hands were steady with the small axe, though he stayed close to guide her movements. Soon the fire was crackling merrily, pushing back the storm's darkness. As afternoon faded to evening, they shared a simple meal of bread and the rabbit from their snares. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin was warm and dry. After the dishes were cleaned, Miriam began to hum as she often did. The hymn was familiar to Abel, one his mother had sung long ago. The tune filled the cabin, mixing with the sound of rain on the roof and the pop of burning wood. Without thinking, Abel found himself whispering the words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Miriam's humming faltered for a moment in surprise, then grew stronger. She began singing the words softly, and Abel's whispered vocals joined her. His voice was rough from disuse, but the words came back as if they had never left. "That saved a wretch like me." They sang together, the old hymn rising to the cabin's rafters. Abel felt something deep inside him shift and settle, like soil after a long drought finally receiving rain. Here in this moment, with the storm outside and faith rekindling within, he realized how much he had missed having someone to share his days with. When the hymn ended, Miriam wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Abel nodded, not trusting his voice just then. He stirred the fire, sending sparks up the chimney into the stormy night. The silence between them was comfortable now, like the silence between father and daughter. As Miriam began another hymn, softer this time, Abel leaned back in his chair. The walls of his heart, built so high after the war, were slowly crumbling. In their place, something new was growing, something that felt remarkably like hope. The morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the cabin's window pane. Abel watched as Miriam wrapped her head carefully in a worn cotton scarf he'd found in his trunk. Her movements were precise, making sure every inch of her scarred scalp was covered. "You don't have to come to church if you ain't ready," Abel said softly, noting her trembling fingers. Miriam straightened her simple dress, one of Abel's old shirts cleverly remade. "I want to go," she said firmly. "The Lord's house is where I belong on his day." Abel nodded, understanding. He helped her onto the mule, then led them down the mountain trail toward the small church in the valley. The path wound through stands of aspen, their leaves turning gold in the autumn air. Miriam hummed hymns as they descended, her clear voice mixing with bird song. As they approached the church, a simple wooden building with a modest steeple, Abel felt Miriam tense. Other folks were arriving too, driving wagons or riding horses. Children ran ahead of their parents, their Sunday best already dusty from play. The whispers started as soon as they dismounted. Abel heard them clearly, though he wished he couldn't. "Who's that with Abel Rowan? Strange-looking girl. No shoes, look at her feet. Heard tell of a cursed woman up in his cabin." Miriam's chin lifted slightly, but Abel saw the hurt in her eyes. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder as they walked toward the church steps. "Cursed," someone muttered, just loud enough to hear. "Ain't natural, a woman with no hair." Before Abel could respond, Pastor Silas Hodge appeared at the door. His kind eyes took in the situation quickly, and he stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Welcome," he said warmly, though Abel noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "I'm Pastor Hodge. Please, come in and join us." Miriam ducked her head respectfully. "Thank you, Pastor. God's peace be with you." Her formal greeting, spoken with such clear faith, seemed to ease some of the tension. Pastor Hodge's smile grew more genuine as he led them to a pew. The church filled quickly. Abel noticed how people either stared openly at Miriam or deliberately avoided looking their way. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the crude wooden cross hanging behind the pulpit. As Pastor Hodge began the service, Abel found himself watching a group of travelers seated near the front. Their plain dress and full beards marked them as Amish, likely passing through on their way west. One elder in particular kept glancing back at Miriam whenever she spoke the responses in her Pennsylvania German accent. The sermon spoke of the Good Samaritan, of helping strangers in need. Abel wondered if the pastor had chosen it specially, noting how his eyes often drifted to their pew. Miriam listened intently, her lips moving in silent prayer. When the service ended, the Amish elder approached them before they could leave. His deep-set eyes were kind beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Excuse me," he said softly in English, then switched to Pennsylvania German. Miriam's eyes widened as she responded in the same dialect. Abel couldn't follow their rapid exchange, but he saw hope blooming on Miriam's face. The elder turned to Abel, switching back to English. "She speaks the true dialect of our people from Pennsylvania, the same as my own family from Lancaster County." He studied Miriam thoughtfully. Many Amish families have traveled west these past years, wagon trains seeking new lands. Some were lost to hardship. "Lost?" Miriam's voice trembled, and the elder nodded gravely. "Fever took some. Others scattered in storms or Indian raids. But many survived, forming new settlements." He patted her hand gently. "Your people may still live, child. Do not lose hope." Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you for this kindness." Their conversation drew attention. Abel noticed the church members gathering in small clusters, talking in low voices. Some, like widow Sarah Thompson, looked on with sympathy. Others, like Marcus Webb, the railroad man, watched with obvious suspicion. Pastor Hodge made his way over, Bible clutched to his chest. "Brother," he addressed the Amish elder, "you confirm this young woman's heritage?" "I do," the elder said firmly. "She speaks our tongue as one born to it. Her prayers and manner are true to our ways." The pastor nodded slowly, then turned to Miriam. "You are welcome here, child. Whatever your past, God's house turns none away." But Abel could see the division forming among the townspeople. For every friendly nod there was a dark look. For every warm smile, a turned back. The railroad men particularly seemed agitated, gathering in a tight knot by their horses. "We should head back," Abel said quietly. "Storm clouds building over the peaks." They said their goodbyes, Miriam exchanging a few more words in Pennsylvania German with the elder. As Abel helped her mount the mule, he heard Marcus Webb's carrying whisper, "Ain't right, harboring a runaway. Man'll find himself in trouble, mark my words." The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought. When the cabin came into view, Miriam finally spoke. "Do you think it's true?" Her voice was small against the mountain wind. "That my family might still live?" Abel helped her down from the mule, considering his words carefully. "Reckon it's possible. West's a big place, but news travels. If they're out there, we'll find a way to know." Inside the cabin, Miriam sank into a chair by the fire, unwinding her scarf with trembling fingers. "Some of them think I'm cursed," she said softly. "Because of my head, my missing memories." Abel stirred the coals, adding a log before turning to her. "Folks fear what they don't understand. But you heard the elder. You're Amish, sure enough. That's something real to hold on to." "You'll help me look for them?" Her eyes sought his, vulnerable yet hopeful. "I promise." Abel's voice was firm. "Come spring, we'll start asking at settlements, sending letters. Your people are out there somewhere, and we'll find them." Miriam's smile was watery but genuine. She began to hum as she started supper preparations, an Amish hymn the elder had sung. Abel watched her work, seeing how she moved with more certainty now, as if knowing her heritage had anchored her somehow. Later, as darkness fell, Abel stepped outside to check the stock. The evening star was bright above the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. He thought about the divided faces at church, the whispers, the threats barely veiled in Webb's words. But when he returned inside, Miriam was kneading bread, her movements sure and peaceful, singing softly in her childhood tongue. Whatever trouble might come, Abel knew he'd made the right choice. That stormy night he'd opened his door. God, it seemed, had plans even for a worn-out mountain man who'd lost his way. The cabin was warm with firelight and the smell of baking bread. Outside, the wind sang through pine boughs, and the stars wheeled overhead, keeping their ancient watch over the mountains and the souls who dwelt in their shadow. The mountain air grew sharper with each passing day. Mornings brought frost that glittered on fallen pine needles, and evenings came earlier, painting the peaks in purple shadows. Abel watched Miriam adapt to the rhythm of mountain life, her movements growing more confident despite her bare feet. "We need to stack more wood before the snow flies," Abel said one morning, shouldering his axe. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge, but already Miriam was up, stoking the cook fire. "Winter comes hard up here." "I'll help," she offered, reaching for her shawl. Abel paused, studying her raw feet. The thought had been nagging at him for days. No one could survive a mountain winter barefoot. "First, we need to see to something else." He retrieved a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin from beneath his bunk. Inside lay pieces of leather he'd been working on in secret during the evenings. Soles cut thick and sturdy, uppers shaped to wrap snugly around ankles. Leather strips for lacing. "Never made shoes before," he admitted, laying out the pieces, "but I reckon these might serve." Miriam's eyes widened. "You made these, Mai, for me?" Abel nodded, suddenly self-conscious of his rough handiwork. "Been watching how you walk, measuring your steps in the dust. Might not be pretty as store-bought boots, but they'll keep your feet warm and protected." Miriam touched the leather reverently. "I don't know what to say." "Let's try them first before you thank me." Might have got it all wrong. But he hadn't. The shoes fit remarkably well. Though Abel had to show her how to lace them properly, his big fingers surprisingly nimble with the leather strips. When Miriam stood in them for the first time, tears spilled down her cheeks. "I can walk," she whispered, taking careful steps across the cabin floor. "It doesn't hurt anymore." Abel felt something catch in his throat watching her. It reminded him of long ago days, teaching his little sister to walk. The memory, usually so painful, felt different now, warmer somehow. "They'll need breaking in," he said gruffly, hiding his emotion. "But they'll serve." Miriam walked to the door and back, each step more confident. The shoes made solid little taps against the wooden floor. "God bless you, Abel Rowan," she said softly, "for showing such kindness to a stranger." "Ain't strangers anymore," Abel replied. "Now let's see how they do with real work." They spent the morning hauling and stacking firewood, Miriam's new shoes protecting her feet from splinters and sharp rocks. Abel showed her how to judge which logs would burn longest, how to stack them so air could flow between. She learned quickly, humming hymns as she worked. By midday, they had an impressive pile of wood. Abel's back ached, but it was a good ache. Honest work shared with someone else made the burden lighter. They were just starting another stack when hoofbeats sounded on the trail. It was Sarah Thompson, the widow who lived nearest town. She rode up on her gentle bay mare, a basket covered with cloth on her saddle horn. "Good day to you both," she called, dismounting. "Brought news from town. Church is having a harvest picnic this evening. Pastor Hodge asked me specially to invite you." Abel felt Miriam stiffen beside him. The memory of whispers and stares from their last church visit was still fresh. "That's kind," Abel said carefully, "but we've got work to finish here." "Nonsense, Sarah declared. "Wood'll keep till tomorrow. Besides, town needs to know you both proper. Can't hide up here forever." She turned to Miriam with a warm smile. "There'll be music, and plenty of good food. Even some Amish families passing through might attend." Miriam's face brightened at that, though anxiety still showed in her eyes. She looked to Abel questioningly. He studied her a moment, seeing both her fear and her longing to belong. "Your choice," he said gently. "But if you want to go, I'll be right beside you." Miriam squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. "I would like to try," she said. "These new shoes make me feel braver somehow." Sarah noticed the footwear then. "Why, those are fine-looking boots. Where did you get them?" "Abel made them," Miriam said proudly. "Just finished this morning?" Sarah's eyebrows rose as she examined the craftsmanship. "Well now, Abel Rowan. Didn't know you had such skills hidden away up here." Abel shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just leather and luck is all." "Luck and love," Sarah corrected softly, giving him a knowing look. "Well then, shall I tell Pastor Hodge to expect you both?" Picnic starts at sunset. After Sarah rode away, Abel and Miriam prepared for the evening. She brushed her dress carefully while Abel curried the mule. The autumn sun was already sliding toward the western peaks when they set out. Miriam seated sideways on the mule's broad back, Abel leading them down the familiar trail. The evening light turned everything to gold. The aspen leaves, the prairie grass, even the dust their mule kicked up. Miriam's new shoes tapped steadily against the stirrup, keeping time with their movement. She sat straighter than she had on their last trip to town, Abel noticed, as if the shoes lent her a dignity she'd been missing. "Remember," he said as they approached the church grounds, "you've got as much right to be here as anyone. More than some, I reckon, given how you pray." Miriam nodded, though her hands twisted nervously in her skirts. "Do you think there will really be Amish families there?" "We'll see soon enough." The churchyard was already filled with wagons and horses. Lanterns hung from tree branches, and tables groaned under covered dishes. Children darted between adults, playing tag in the lengthening shadows. Music drifted from somewhere, a fiddle and guitar playing hymn tunes. Abel helped Miriam down from the mule, keeping a protective hand under her elbow. Conversations paused as people noticed them, but Sarah Thompson hurried over before awkwardness could settle. "There you are. Come, I've saved places at our table." She led them through the crowd, calling cheerful greetings to others. Her natural ease seemed to smooth their path, and soon they were seated with plates of food: fried chicken, cornbread, apple pie, and more delicacies than Abel had seen in months. Miriam bowed her head to pray before eating, her soft German words drawing attention from nearby tables. But this time, instead of suspicious whispers, an elderly voice responded in the same tongue. It was one of the traveling Amish men they'd met at church, accompanied by his wife and grown daughter. They joined the table, speaking warmly to Miriam in their shared dialect. Abel couldn't follow the conversation, but he saw how Miriam's face glowed in the lantern light, how her shoulders relaxed as she found common ground with these strangers who shared her faith. The evening deepened into dusk. More lanterns were lit, and the music grew livelier. Young couples began to dance, though the Amish folks kept to their seats, tapping their feet in time. Abel watched it all, noting how the initial stiffness of the crowd had mellowed. Even Marcus Webb and his railroad men kept their distance, though they cast dark looks occasionally. "Your shoes are very fine," the Amish woman said to Miriam in careful English, pointing to her feet. "Good leather, good stitching." "Abel made them," Miriam replied, that same note of pride in her voice. "He saw I had need and provided." The woman's wise eyes moved between them, seeing perhaps more than Abel was comfortable with. "God puts people in our path when we need them most," she said simply. "Both the ones who need help and the ones who need to give it." Abel shifted in his seat, but before he could respond, Pastor Hodge called everyone to evening prayers. They stood together, a community under the stars, while cicadas sang in the grass and the first cool breeze of night swept down from the mountains. Looking around at the flickering lanterns, the bowed heads, the way Miriam stood tall in her new shoes between him and their Amish neighbors, Abel felt something settle in his heart. This was right, he thought. This was how healing began. With small steps, with shared meals, with the simple dignity of having sturdy shoes to walk God's earth. The prayer ended, but the peace remained. Miriam's new shoes tapped softly as she helped clear the tables, the sound mixing with laughter and talk and music in the gathering dark. She belonged here, Abel realized. And maybe, just maybe, so did he. The fiddle music swirled through the evening air, mixing with laughter and the clinking of plates. Lantern light cast warm circles across the churchyard, where townsfolk gathered in clusters around rough-hewn tables. Abel stood back, watching as Miriam helped Sarah Thompson serve slices of apple pie. Her new shoes clicked against the packed earth, steady and sure. He noticed how people still watched her, sideways glances when they thought no one was looking. Some faces showed curiosity, others unease. The rawness of her scalp beneath her headscarf drew attention, but Miriam kept her chin high, moving with quiet grace. Pastor Hodge approached the center of the gathering, raising his hands for attention, "Friends and neighbors," he called out. "As is our custom at these gatherings, we'll have some songs before the night grows too old. Who'll start us off?" Several of the usual singers stepped forward. Mary Peterson with her strong alto, young Thomas Webb who knew all the verses to Amazing Grace. The fiddle player accompanied each one, his bow drawing sweet notes from the strings. Then Sarah Thompson spoke up. "Miriam," she said warmly, "I've heard you humming hymns while you worked today. Won't you share one with us?" A hush fell over the crowd. Abel saw Miriam's hands twist in her apron, but there was eagerness in her face too. She glanced at him, and he nodded encouragement. "I know mostly German songs," she said softly. "All the better," Pastor Hodge replied. "The Lord hears praise in every tongue." Miriam stepped forward, clasping her hands before her. For a moment she stood silent. Then her clear voice rose into the night air, carrying words Abel didn't understand but melody that touched something deep in his soul. It was an old hymn. He could tell by the way it moved. Something that might have been sung in barn meetings and family gatherings for generations. The fiddle player listened for a few measures, then began to play along, his notes weaving around her voice like silver thread. The Amish families nodded in recognition, some joining softly in harmony. Abel watched the faces in the crowd change as Miriam sang. Suspicion melted into wonder. Children stopped their games to listen. Even Marcus Webb's hard expression softened at the edges. When the last note faded into the cricket-filled darkness, silence held for a heartbeat. Then applause broke out. Genuine, warm appreciation that brought color to Miriam's cheeks. The Amish woman, who had admired her shoes earlier, pressed her hand, murmuring something that made Miriam smile. "Another?" someone called, and others joined in. Miriam sang twice more, once alone and once with the Amish family joining in full voice. The harmony of their German words filled the churchyard with something ancient and holy. After that, the ice was truly broken. Women who had held back before now came to speak with Miriam, admiring her neat stitching on Abel's shirt, asking about her recipes. Children no longer shied away but offered her pieces of candy saved from their pockets. Abel felt his chest tighten watching her. She was glowing not just from the lantern light but from within, the joy of belonging finally pushing back the shadows of her lost memories. God had not just sent him someone to care for, he realized. He had sent someone who could bring life back to his cabin, someone whose faith shone bright enough to light the dark corners of his own heart. As the evening wound down and families began loading their wagons, Miriam came to stand beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing me here. For the shoes. For..." She gestured at the gathering. "For letting me find a place." Abel nodded, not trusting his voice. They said their goodbyes. Sarah Thompson hugging Miriam warmly. Pastor Hodge shaking Abel's hand with real friendship. The Amish family extracting a promise of future visits. The moon had risen by the time they started home, bright enough to silver the trail before them. Abel led the mule, Miriam walking beside him rather than riding. Her new shoes whispered through the grass. "I never thought to have family again," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "After waking with no memory, no name even. But tonight, with the singing and the sharing of food," she paused. "It felt like family." "Reckon it did," Abel agreed. He thought of his own long years of solitude, how he had convinced himself he preferred it that way. "Cabin's been different since you came. Warmer somehow. Not just the bread baking?" There was a smile in her voice. "And not just that." He cleared his throat. "Been thinking maybe we could fix up the lean-to, make a proper room for you. Put in a window so you can see the mountains while you sew." Miriam's step faltered and she caught his arm. "Truly? You would want me to stay?" "If you've a mind to. Until we find your people or..." He left the rest unspoken, but she seemed to understand. They walked on, talking of possibilities. A vegetable patch come spring, maybe some sheep for wool, ways to make the cabin more of a home. Abel found himself sharing memories of his mother's kitchen, stories he hadn't thought of in years. The moon climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the trail. They were nearly home when Abel noticed something wrong. His steps slowed. "What is it?" Miriam whispered, sensing his tension. Light in the trees. Too red for moonlight, so now she saw it too. The flicker of torches moving through the forest near the cabin. Abel counted at least 3 distinct flames. His hand went to the rifle slung across his back. "The railroad men?" Miriam's voice shook slightly. "Likely." Abel touched her arm. "Walk on casual-like, but when we reach the clearing, I want you to take the mule and go straight to Sarah Thompson's place. Don't stop for anything. I won't leave you alone." "Miriam." He turned to face her, seeing the stubbornness in her expression even in the darkness. "Promise me, Sarah will send for the sheriff." Before she could answer, a torch emerged from the trees into the clearing ahead. Marcus Webb's voice carried clearly. "Well, now look who's finally coming home." Marcus Webb's torch cast dancing shadows across the clearing as more men emerged from the trees. Abel counted 6 of them total, all carrying weapons. His grip tightened on his rifle, but he knew drawing it would only bring bloodshed. "Step aside, mountain man," Webb called out, his voice thick with whiskey. "We got papers here say the girl belongs to the railroad company." "That's a lie," Abel growled, moving to shield Miriam. He could feel her trembling behind him, her fingers clutching his coat. The men spread out in a half circle, hemming them in against the cabin wall. The torchlight caught their faces, not just railroad men now, but some faces Abel recognized from town. Men who'd smiled and nodded at church just hours ago. Webb pulled a folded document from his vest. Contract of indenture, signed proper and legal. Girl was brought west to work in the company kitchens. Ran off 3 weeks back, stealing company property. "She's Amish folk," Abel countered. "Got nothing to do with your railroad." "Paper says different." Webb's smile turned ugly. "Now stand down, lest you want trouble." Thunder rumbled overhead and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Abel felt the weight of his rifle, knew he could maybe take 2 or 3 before they rushed him. But then what of Miriam? "Please," Miriam's voice came soft but clear. "I don't remember signing any paper. I don't remember anything before." "Convenient, ain't it?" One of the other men laughed. "A memory goes missing right when you need it." The rain fell harder now, turning the torchlight into hissing circles of orange in the darkness. Abel's mind raced, trying to find a way out. If he could just get Miriam on the mule, Webb must have read his thoughts. "Don't try nothing foolish, Rowan. You're outnumbered, and that German girl ain't worth dying over." "She's under my protection," Abel declared, his voice carrying over the storm. "Any man tries to take her answers to me." For a moment, the only sound was rain hitting the cabin roof. Then Webb nodded to his men. "Take her." They came in a rush. Abel swung his rifle like a club, catching the first man across the jaw. Miriam screamed as hands grabbed for her. Abel fought like a man possessed, his fists connecting with flesh, driving them back. For a moment, he thought they might break free. Then something hard cracked against the back of his head. The world tilted sideways as he stumbled. Another blow caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He went down hard in the mud, tasting blood. Through blurred vision, he saw them dragging Miriam away. Her new shoes, the ones he'd carved with such care, lay abandoned in the dirt where they'd been torn from her feet. She fought against their grip, reaching toward him. "Abel." Her cry pierced through the thunder. "Abel, please." He tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't hold him. Webb's boot caught him in the side, sending fresh pain shooting through his chest. "Stay down, mountain man," Webb spat. "Consider this a kindness, and we could have hung you for harboring a runaway." Abel could only watch helplessly as they forced Miriam onto a horse. The rain plastered her headscarf to her scarred scalp, her face pale in the torchlight. She was singing, no, praying, in German, the words carrying faintly through the storm until they faded into darkness. He lay there in the mud long after the sound of hooves had disappeared, rain washing over him. Finally, using the cabin wall for support, he dragged himself to his feet. Pain lanced through his head with every movement. Inside, the cabin felt vast and empty. The fire had burned low, casting weak light over the signs of Miriam's presence. Her neatly folded blanket, the mended shirts hanging by the hearth, the half-finished loaf of bread she'd been baking before the church social. Abel sank into his chair, head in his hands. The old familiar darkness crept back into his heart, whispering that he'd been a fool to think he deserved peace. God had abandoned him in the war, abandoned him to years of solitude, and now had taken away the one light he'd found in all that darkness. His fingers brushed something soft, the scrap of cloth Miriam used to wrap her sewing needles. The sight of it broke something inside him. A sound escaped his throat, half growl and half sob. The bread still sat on the hearth, its crust golden in the dying firelight. Abel could almost see Miriam kneading it that morning, humming her hymns as she worked the dough. Her small hands had shaped it with such care, such faith, that there would be more mornings, more shared meals in this place she'd begun to call home. He picked up the loaf, cradling it like something precious. The surface still held the impression of her fingers, the last trace of her touch in this empty cabin. Rain drummed on the roof, no longer softened by the sound of her voice. "I won't give up," he whispered, the words a prayer and a promise. "I'll find you, girl. Whatever it takes." The fire crackled low, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Abel's heart, something hardened into steel. He had lost her once, but by God's grace, he would not lose her again. His ribs screamed as he pushed himself up, but he ignored the pain. There was work to be done. He needed supplies, fresh horses, maybe men he could trust. The railroad men had papers, but papers could lie. Somewhere out there was the truth of who Miriam really was, and he would find it. Abel moved slowly through the cabin, gathering what he'd need. His fingers brushed the Bible his mother had given him, the one Miriam had read from each morning. He tucked it into his pack alongside bandages and ammunition. The storm showed no sign of letting up, but Abel barely noticed the rain now. His mind was already on the trail ahead, planning his next move. They'd taken Miriam west, toward the railroad camps. He'd start there, asking questions, watching for signs. He touched the unfinished loaf one last time, remembering her smile just hours ago at the church social. She had found belonging here, found family. No piece of paper could change that truth. "Hold on, Miriam," he murmured into the darkness. "I'm coming." Dawn painted the mountain sky in shades of amber and rose as Abel guided his mule down the muddy trail toward town. Each hoofbeat sent jolts of pain through his battered ribs, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. The previous night's rain had left everything damp and glistening, the air sharp with the scent of wet pine. His face was a map of bruises, eye swollen nearly shut where Webb's men had struck him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Miriam being dragged away, heard her desperate cry carried away by the storm. Main Street was just coming alive as Abel rode in. Shopkeepers swept their wooden sidewalks, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery. A few early risers paused to stare at his battered appearance, but Abel paid them no mind. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, and Sheriff Amos Cutter sat behind his desk, boots propped up, coffee cup in hand. His weathered face showed no surprise at Abel's condition. "Figured you'd show up," Cutter drawled, not bothering to rise. "Heard there was some excitement up your way last night." Abel's hands clenched into fists. They took her. Railroad men with forged papers, claiming she was their servant. "Papers looked legal enough to me." Cutter sipped his coffee. "Webb showed them yesterday afternoon. All proper stamps and signatures." "You knew?" Abel's voice dropped dangerously low. "You knew they were coming for her?" Cutter shrugged. "Ain't my place to interfere in company business. Girl was their property, legal and proper." "She's a person, not property." Abel slammed his palm on the desk, making the coffee cup jump. "She's Amish folk, lost and alone, and you let them take her." "Watch yourself, Rowan." Cutter's hand drifted toward his holstered pistol. "I'm still the law here. Railroads got influence all through this territory. Man could get himself in real trouble going against them." Abel straightened slowly, disgust twisting his features. "You wear that badge, but you ain't no law. You're just another man the railroad bought." He turned and stalked out, leaving Cutter's protests behind him. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the damp streets as Abel made his way to the small white church on the edge of town. Pastor Silas Hodge was tending his garden when Abel approached. The preacher's kind face creased with concern at Abel's appearance. "Good Lord, brother. What happened to you?" Abel sank onto a wooden bench, suddenly bone-weary. In halting words, he told the pastor everything. The midnight raid, the false papers, Miriam's terrified cries as they dragged her away. Silas listened quietly, hands folded in prayer. When Abel finished, the pastor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The railroad's power in these parts troubles my heart," he said softly. "They build their empire on the backs of the poor and forgotten, twisting man's law to serve their greed." "I need your help, Pastor," Abel said. "I can't let them keep her. There must be some way." Silas placed a gentle hand on Abel's shoulder. "Let us pray first, brother. True justice belongs to God, and his eye sees all." Abel bowed his head as the pastor's voice rose in prayer, asking for guidance, protection, and the triumph of truth over lies. The words washed over him like cool water, easing some of the rage in his heart. When they finished, Silas looked thoughtful. "The county clerk keeps records of all land claims and legal documents. If there's truth to be found about Miriam's past, it might be there." Hope stirred in Abel's chest. "Where's the clerk's office?" 2 days' ride to the county seat." Silas disappeared into the church and returned with a folded paper. "Here's a letter of introduction to Clerk Matthews. He's a God-fearing man who might help, especially if there's fraud involved." Abel tucked the letter carefully into his coat. "Thank you, Pastor." "I'll keep praying," Silas promised, "and I'll send word if I hear anything about Miriam's whereabouts." The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Abel restocked supplies at the general store, borrowed a fresh horse from a sympathetic rancher, and set out for the county seat. The mountain trails were treacherous after the rain, but he pushed on, stopping only when his mount needed rest. He reached the county seat as sunset painted the sky crimson on the second day. The clerk's office was closed, forcing him to wait through a restless night at the local boarding house. Sleep eluded him as memories of Miriam's songs echoed in his mind. At first light, Abel presented himself at the clerk's office, Silas's letter in hand. Clerk Matthews proved to be a thin, serious man with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed spectacles. "Land fraud, you say?" Matthews frowned as he read the pastor's letter. "Serious business. The railroad's been known to bend the truth when it suits them, but proving it won't be easy." "I'll search every paper in this building if I have to," Abel declared. Matthews nodded slowly. "Well, we'll start with land claims from 5 years back when the Amish wagons came through. Work forward from there." Days blurred together as Abel pored over dusty ledgers and faded documents. His eyes burned from squinting at cramped handwriting, but he refused to give up. Matthews helped when he could, teaching Abel to decipher the legal language and complex filing systems. On the 4th day, Abel's persistence paid off. In a leather-bound volume of homestead claims, he found it, a land grant filed by Jacob Yoder on behalf of his family, including his daughter Hannah. The claim encompassed 300 acres of prime valley land, directly in the path of the railroad's planned expansion. "Look at this," Matthews said, pulling another document. "The Yoder family disappeared during the winter storms that year. No bodies found, but the wagon was abandoned." Abel's heart raced as he compared the documents, the dates, the location. It all fit. And there was something else, a detail that made his blood run cold. "The description," he whispered. "Hannah Yoder, age 16. Light brown eyes, fair skin." Matthews adjusted his spectacles. What is it?" "Miriam, the girl they took. She matches this exactly, and look here." Abel pointed to a notation. The land grant included provisions for any surviving heirs. "Which means—" Matthews's eyes widened as he understood. "She's not their servant. She's Hannah Yoder, rightful heir to that land claim." Abel's voice shook with the magnitude of the discovery. "The railroad forged those indenture papers to get control of her property?" Matthews pulled out fresh paper, dipping his pen in ink. "We need to document this properly. With a judge's seal, these records will prove the railroad's fraud." Hope blazed in Abel's chest as they worked to compile the evidence. Each new detail strengthened their case. The timing of the Yoder family's disappearance, the value of the land, the suspicious timing of the railroad's sudden servant claim. The railroad men knew, Abel realized, rage building inside him. They knew who she was all along. They just waited until her memory was gone to make their move. Matthews's pen scratched across the paper, recording everything. This is more than fraud. It's criminal conspiracy. Even the railroad can't ignore this evidence. Abel gathered the precious documents, handling them like holy things. Here was proof of Miriam's true identity, her rightful inheritance, and the railroad's deception. Here was hope. "Thank you," he said hoarsely to Matthews. "I don't know how to repay you." The clerk waved away his thanks. "Just see justice done. That girl deserves to know who she really is." Abel carefully stored the documents in his saddlebags, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. Somewhere out there, Miriam, Hannah, was waiting, not knowing she was the rightful owner of valuable land, not knowing she had a name, a history, a place where she belonged. The truth had been hidden in these dusty records all along, waiting to be discovered. Now, armed with this knowledge, Abel could fight back against the railroad's lies. He could help Miriam reclaim not just her freedom, but her very identity. Abel rode back to town with precious documents secured in his leather satchel, each bump of the horse's gait reminding him of their importance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as he dismounted in front of the church. Pastor Silas stood waiting on the steps, his weathered face showing both concern and hope. "Did you find what you were looking for, brother?" the pastor asked, helping Abel with his gear. "More than that," Abel replied, his voice rough from trail dust. "I found her true name. She's Hannah Yoder, daughter of Jacob Yoder, and that land the railroad wants, it's rightfully hers." Inside the church's small study, Abel spread the documents across the pastor's desk. Lamplight gleamed on official seals and faded ink as he explained everything: the land grant, the lost family, the railroad's deception. Silas listened intently, his fingers tracing the signatures on the yellowed papers. "The Lord's hand is in this," Silas said finally, looking up with bright eyes. "But the railroad won't give up easily. They've built their empire on such schemes." Abel's jaw tightened. "Which is why we need to expose them publicly. Not just to a judge in some back room where money can talk louder than truth." "The whole community needs to witness it," Silas agreed, standing to pace the small room. "This coming Sabbath, perhaps. After services, when everyone's gathered." "But first," Abel said, "I need to find her. Make sure she's safe." Silas nodded gravely. "I've heard whispers. They're holding her at their camp north of town, where they're laying new track." As darkness fell that evening, Abel prepared carefully. He checked his rifle but left it behind. He couldn't risk a shooting. Instead, he packed rope, a knife, and dark clothes. The railroad camp lay 3 miles outside town, its fires visible against the mountain sky. Abel approached on foot, moving silently through the shadows like he'd done years ago in the war. The camp sprawled across a clearing, canvas tents, cook fires, and the skeleton of new track gleaming in the moonlight. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but their patterns were lazy, predictable. He crouched in the darkness, watching, listening. Then he heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A hymn, sung soft and clear in German, drifting from a tent set apart from the others. Abel's heart clenched. Miriam was alive. Moving closer, careful to stay hidden, he could see shadows through the canvas. A figure sat inside, head bowed. The hymn continued, words of praise rising to heaven despite earthly chains. Abel's hands curled into fists, fury warring with the need for patience. "I'm coming for you," he whispered into the night. "I swear by God's grace I'll bring you home." Unable to risk more, he retreated as silently as he'd come. But knowing she lived, hearing her unbroken spirit in that hymn, filled him with fresh determination. Dawn found him back in town, mind working through plans. He visited Tom Baker at the general store first, a man who'd lost grazing land to railroad expansion. "They're holding her against her will," Abel explained quietly as Tom measured coffee beans. "And I can prove they forged documents to steal her inheritance." Tom's weathered face hardened. "Wouldn't be the first time. Count me in, whatever you need." Next came Widow Harrison, whose late husband had worked laying track until a suspicious accident. She listened intently, fingers worrying her apron. "That poor girl," she said, "singing hymns at the picnic, so sweet and proper. Those railroad men are devils in fine coats." By midday, Abel had gathered a small group of townspeople who'd felt the railroad's heavy hand: farmers, merchants, craftsmen. They met in the church basement, speaking in low voices as Pastor Silas laid out the plan. "Sunday after services," the pastor explained, "when the railroad men come to town for supplies, we'll confront them publicly, with witnesses and evidence. No violence, just God's truth brought to light. Abel nodded. I'll need some of you watching the camp, making sure they don't move her beforehand. Others to help spread word through town. Get people to stay after services. What about the sheriff? Someone asked. Leave him to me, Pastor Silas said firmly. Even he'll have to listen when the whole town demands justice. They worked through details as afternoon faded to evening. Abel felt hope rising with each person who pledged support. The railroad had power, but they'd forgotten the strength of common folk standing together. That night, unable to sleep, Abel sat in his cabin reading the documents again by lamplight. Hannah Yoder. The name felt strange after knowing her as Miriam. But it was her true name, her birthright. The papers trembled slightly in his hands as he imagined telling her, watching recognition dawn in those gentle eyes. Soon, he whispered to the quiet cabin, soon you'll know who you are. The next 2 days passed in careful preparation. Abel worked with the pastor to organize their evidence, making copies of key documents. They arranged for witnesses to be ready. The county clerk had even agreed to ride in for the confrontation. Through it all, Abel's thoughts kept returning to that tent in the railroad camp, to hymns sung in darkness. Each night he slipped close enough to hear her voice, to assure himself she still lived. Each night his resolve grew stronger. Saturday evening found him in the church with Pastor Silas reviewing their plans one final time. Outside, the setting sun painted the windows in shades of amber and gold. Are you ready for this? Silas asked quietly. Abel looked down at his calloused hands, remembering how gently they'd washed Miriam's feet that first night. How carefully they'd carved her shoes. How powerless they'd been when the railroad men took her. I'm ready, he said. God help me, I'm ready to bring her home. The pastor squeezed his shoulder. The Lord's justice may be slow, brother, but it never fails. Tomorrow, we'll see it done. Abel stepped out into the gathering dusk, his heart both heavy and light. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or tragedy. But at least Miriam, Hannah, would know the truth. Would know she wasn't alone. Stars began appearing overhead as he walked home, their light steady and pure. Somewhere in the darkness, a girl without a past sang hymns of hope. Tomorrow, if God was merciful, those hymns would ring out in freedom. The Sabbath morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the church's simple windows onto rough-hewn pews. Townspeople filed in slowly, dressed in their Sunday best. Women smoothed skirts and adjusted bonnets while men removed their hats, nodding greetings to neighbors. The usual quiet murmur of pre-service conversation filled the small sanctuary. Near the back, several railroad men entered, their fine suits and polished boots marking them as different from the working folk. They settled into pews with an air of entitled confidence, casting superior glances around the humble church. A few townsfolk shifted uneasily, moving away from them. Pastor Silas stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him, watching his congregation gather. His weathered face showed no sign of the tension he surely felt. Instead, he offered gentle smiles to each person who entered, railroad men included. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he began leading the opening hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, the congregation sang, voices rising to the wooden rafters. Some railroad men remained silent, while others joined half-heartedly, clearly impatient for the service to end so they could return to their business in town. As the final notes faded, the pastor began his sermon. He spoke of justice, of God's eternal truth bringing light to darkness. His words seemed to carry special weight this morning, though only a few knew why. In the front pews, Tom Baker and Widow Harrison exchanged knowing glances. The service continued, sunlight slowly moving across the floor as minutes passed. Then, just as Pastor Silas prepared to deliver his final blessing, the church door creaked open. Heads turned to see Abel Rowan step inside, his clothes trail dusty but his bearing straight and determined. In his hands, he carried a leather document case. A few gasps rose from the congregation at his appearance. His face bore fresh bruises, evidence of some recent struggle, but his eyes were clear and purposeful. He made his way down the center aisle, boots striking the wooden floor in measured steps. Begging your pardon, Pastor, Abel said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, but there's a matter of God's justice that needs speaking today. Pastor Silas nodded slowly. The Lord's house is where truth should be heard. Speak, brother. Abel turned to face the congregation, opening the document case. His hands were steady as he withdrew several papers, though anyone who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw. "These here are land deed records from the county office," he began, holding them up so all could see the official seals. "They tell a story that some men have tried to hide. A story about a young woman named Hannah Yoder." At the name, several railroad men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One started to rise, but a sharp look from his companions kept him seated. "Hannah Yoder," Abel continued, "was the daughter of Jacob Yoder, an Amish man who brought his family west 5 years ago. They filed proper claim to land north of town, land the railroad now claims as their own." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That same land they're using to justify holding an innocent woman captive." Murmurs rippled through the church. Everyone knew of the strange, bald girl who'd appeared at Abel's cabin, who'd sung so sweetly at the picnic before being taken away. "The woman you know as Miriam," Abel said, his voice growing stronger, "is Hannah Yoder. And these papers prove she's the rightful heir to her family's land. The railroad's claims of indenture are forgeries, meant to steal what's hers by a law and birthright." The railroad men were on their feet now, faces dark with anger. "This is slander," one shouted. "We have proper papers." "Indeed you do." A new voice spoke from near the door. Judge Harrison, who'd been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. The elderly judge was respected throughout the county for his unwavering fairness. "I'd like to examine those documents, Mr. Rowan." Abel walked back and handed the papers to the judge, who put on his spectacles and began studying them carefully. The church fell silent except for the soft rustle of pages turning. Minutes stretched out like hours. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up, his expression grave. "These land deed records are genuine, bearing proper seals and signatures. The Yoder family's claim is legally sound." He turned to face the railroad men. "I've also examined your supposed indenture contract. The signatures don't match any other Yoder family documents. They're clear forgeries." More gasps filled the church. The railroad men's faces had gone pale beneath their anger. "By the authority vested in me," the judge continued, "I declare the railroad's claim null and void. The woman known as Miriam, Hannah Yoder, is hereby recognized as the rightful heir to the Yoder land claim. She is a free woman, not bound by any false contract." A commotion erupted near the back of the church. 2 men burst in, supporting between them a familiar figure. Miriam, still dressed in rough work clothes, her head still bare, stumbled slightly as they helped her forward. Abel recognized Tom Baker's sons who'd been watching the railroad camp. "Found her walking toward town," one explained breathlessly. "They'd left her tied up when they came to service. She got herself free." Abel rushed to meet them, taking Miriam's arm gently. Her wrists were raw from ropes, but her eyes were clear and determined. Together they walked to the front of the church. "Hannah," Abel said softly, "your true name is Hannah Yoder." She stared at him, then at the papers the judge held. Something flickered in her eyes, a spark of recognition, of memory. "The farm," she whispered. "Papa's farm, with the big oak tree." "Yes," Abel said, his voice rough with emotion, "it's yours now. You're free." The railroad men started toward them, but Pastor Silas stepped between, his Bible held high. "God's truth has been spoken," he declared. "The law has ruled. Any man who defies this ruling will answer to both earthly and heavenly justice." Behind him, several of the townsmen stood up, faces set. The railroad men looked around the church, seeing nothing but stern determination in every face. Slowly, reluctantly, they backed down. "This isn't over," one muttered as they headed for the door. "The company has lawyers." "Who will see the same evidence I've seen," Judge Harrison cut in. "The truth doesn't change, no matter how many lawyers you hire." As the railroad men's boots faded down the church steps, Hannah, began to shake. Abel steadied her, feeling her tears wet his sleeve. But when she lifted her face, she was smiling. "I remember," she said wonderingly. "Not everything, but pieces. The journey west. Mama's garden. Papa reading scripture by lamplight." She touched her bare head. There was fever. Fire. I ran. "You're safe now," Abel assured her, his own eyes damp. "You're home." Someone in the congregation began to sing, a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. Others joined in, the music swelling until it filled every corner of the church. Miriam's clear voice rose with them, German words flowing naturally now that she knew their source. Abel kept hold of her trembling hand as they sang, feeling the pulse of life and hope beneath her skin. Around them, the congregation's voices lifted to heaven, a song of justice restored, of truth revealed, of God's light breaking through darkness. Pastor Silas raised his hands in blessing, and even the dust motes dancing in the sunlit air seemed to shine with divine glory. In that moment, none who witnessed could doubt that the Lord's hand had guided this story to its rightful ending. The last notes of the hymn faded into profound silence. Then, one by one, people came forward to welcome Hannah Yoder home, to touch her hand, to offer quiet words of support. She received each greeting with gentle dignity, though she kept her other hand firmly in Abel's grasp. Through the church windows, morning sun continued to pour in, bright and cleansing as God's own truth. After the service ended, the women of the church gathered around Miriam like a flock of gentle doves. Mrs. Baker, the seamstress, pulled clean fabric from her sewing basket, while others produced needles and thread. "Every proper woman needs a bonnet," Mrs. Baker declared, measuring the soft muslin against Miriam's head. Her fingers were gentle as they traced the scarred scalp. "This will shield you from sun and stares alike, dear one." The women worked together, their needles flashing in the afternoon light streaming through the church windows. They chatted and shared stories, drawing Miriam naturally into their circle. Sarah Johnson offered tales of her own grandmother's journey west, while young Betty Miller showed Miriam how to make neat French knots for decoration. Tears rolled down Miriam's cheeks as the women worked. "I never thought to have sisters again," she whispered, touching the half-finished bonnet with trembling fingers. "The Lord has restored what was lost." From his place near the church door, Abel watched the scene unfold. His chest felt tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude. The girl he'd found barefoot and nameless at his door was blooming under the community's care, like a flower after rain. As evening approached, the church hall filled with savory smells. Townspeople arrived bearing covered dishes and warm bread. Tables groaned under roasted chicken, potato pies, and fresh churned butter. Children darted between the adults, their laughter brightening the wooden walls. "Brother Abel," Pastor Silas called, waving him toward the head table. "Come break bread with us." Abel found himself seated among the elders, included in their discussions of weather and crops. He caught himself smiling more than he had in years. Across the room, Miriam sat among the women, her new bonnet framing her face like a cloud. Her eyes shone as Mrs. Thompson pressed a jar of preserved peaches into her hands. "For your pantry, dear," the older woman said. "Every home needs sweetness." Other gifts followed, a patchwork quilt, garden seeds, cooking pots. Each offering represented not just the item itself, but acceptance into the community's heart. Miriam received them all with quiet grace, her German accent soft as she thanked each giver. Abel watched it all, remembering his own years of solitude. Now, somehow, he too had found his way home. The cabin welcomed them home like a warm embrace. Abel stoked the fire while Miriam arranged their gifts from the church supper on the rough-hewn table. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls as they settled into their evening routine. "I have something to say," Miriam spoke softly, her hands folded in her lap. "You risked everything for me. Your safety, your home, even your life. You are my true protector, sent by God when I had no one." Abel's weathered face softened in the firelight. "You did something for me too, child. Those wounds I carried from the war, the ones that drove me up here alone, nothing ever touched them until you came." He cleared his throat, fighting emotion. "Your faith reminded me of what I'd lost." They shared a simple supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread, the quiet broken only by the pop of burning logs and the distant call of a nightbird. The peace between them felt holy somehow, like a church at twilight. After the bowls were cleared, Miriam carefully opened Abel's mother's Bible. The leather binding was smooth with age, its pages gilt-edged and well-worn. She traced the letters with one finger, determination in her eyes. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read slowly, her German accent thick on the English words. "I shall not want." She stumbled over maketh, but pressed on with a smile, the lamplight gleaming on her scarred head. Abel listened, remembering how his mother had read these same verses. Now another voice brought them to life in his cabin. The words filled the space between them like a blessing. Through the window, fat snowflakes began drifting down, white against the darkening sky. The first real snow of the season, sealing their new life together like a promise. Abel watched it fall, feeling the joy that had been missing from his home for so many years. "He makes me lie down in green pastures," Miriam continued reading, her voice growing more confident. The fire crackled, snow whispered against the window, and in that moment, their little cabin felt like the richest place on earth. Winter settled deep into the Colorado highlands, wrapping Abel's cabin in a thick blanket of white. The mountains stood silent against steel-gray skies as smoke curled steadily from the chimney, marking their home like a beacon in the wilderness. Each morning, Abel and Miriam worked side by side, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The old mule needed extra care now, and Miriam learned to brush his thick winter coat, mixing warm bran mash for his feed. "He's got spirit," she'd say, patting his fuzzy ears while Abel watched, remembering how that same mule had once been his only companion. They fell into a rhythm with their chores. The steady thunk of Abel's axe split wood while Miriam stacked the pieces, her new boots crunching in the snow. When the roof needed patching, she handed up supplies as Abel worked, her clear voice carrying hymns that made the work feel lighter. "We'd best send another letter east," Abel said one evening, watching Miriam mend his wool socks by lamplight. "Pastor Hodge says he can route inquiries through the Philadelphia Meeting House." Miriam nodded, hope bright in her eyes. "Perhaps someone remembers my family's wagon train." Even the smallest thread of news would be a blessing. Her fingers never stopped their careful stitching as she spoke. The next day, they rode to town together, delivering their latest letter to the pastor. "Responses may take months," Pastor Hodge warned gently, "but we'll keep trying." Miriam accepted this with quiet grace, her faith steady as the mountains themselves. Back at the cabin, Abel taught her the skills of survival. She learned to set rabbit snares with clever fingers, to repair leather tack, and to carry water from the stream without spilling a drop. Her strength grew with each passing day, and Abel felt his chest swell with pride when she brought home her first rabbit, caught clean in the trap she'd set herself. Their evenings became precious times of fellowship. After supper, Miriam's voice would rise in familiar hymns, while Abel cleaned his rifle or carved new handles for their tools. Sometimes he shared stories of his younger days, memories he'd thought long buried rising easily now in the warmth of their shared home. One night, watching Miriam stir the stew pot and hum, Abel realized something had changed in his heart. The solitude that had once been his constant companion no longer haunted him. The cabin's corners held warmth instead of shadows. Every task, from feeding chickens to mending fences, felt purposeful now that it served their small family. "We're blessed," Miriam said simply, passing him a bowl of steaming stew. Abel nodded, understanding at last that his years of lonely exile had ended the moment he'd opened his door to a stranger in need. Spring burst across the Colorado highlands in waves of green and gold. Tiny wildflowers dotted the mountainsides like scattered jewels, their delicate petals dancing in the warm breeze. Abel and Miriam walked the familiar path to town, their footsteps steady on the thawing ground. Miriam's shoes, crafted by Abel's loving hands, tapped confidently against the rocky trail. She paused to admire a patch of purple columbines, their faces turned toward the morning sun. "These grow on my land now," she said softly, wonder in her voice. "The land my family chose." Abel nodded, his weathered face gentle. "Your inheritance. Safe and proper now." He watched as she bent to touch the flowers, her bonnet shielding her scarred head from the bright mountain sun. The legal papers were sealed and filed, the railroad's false claims exposed. The land that had drawn her lost family west was finally, rightfully hers. The little white church came into view, its steeple reaching toward heaven. Inside, morning light streamed through plain glass windows as Pastor Hodge stood before the congregation. His voice carried clear and strong through the wooden sanctuary. "Today we celebrate God's provision," the pastor declared. "We witness the blessing of family created not by blood, but by divine purpose." He gestured to Abel and Miriam. "In Abel Rowan, we see a guardian appointed by the Lord himself. In Miriam, we see a daughter restored to family and community." The congregation's voices lifted in song, filling the church with joyful praise. Abel's deep bass joined Miriam's sweet soprano, their harmony a testament to the bond they shared. The music swelled, carrying their gratitude heavenward. After the service, children gathered around Miriam in the churchyard. Their laughter rang pure and free as they admired her new spring bonnet and begged for German hymns. Miriam obliged, her voice strong and sure where once it had trembled with uncertainty. Abel stood among the townspeople, accepting handshakes and kind words. The same community that had once known him only as the solitary mountain man now embraced him as family. His heart, so long frozen in grief, beat warm and whole within his chest. As they walked home beneath the bright Colorado sky, Abel stopped on the trail. His voice, rough with emotion, broke the peaceful afternoon air. "Lord," he prayed aloud, "I thank you for second chances. For redemption I never thought to find." He looked at Miriam, his adopted daughter, standing tall in her proper shoes beside him. "For love restored when I thought all love was lost." Miriam squeezed his hand, tears gleaming in her eyes. Together they continued homeward, father and daughter, their path blessed by spring sunshine and grace. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.